to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swan Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, who is the freer man? The master, the slave, the boss, or the employee? Tim.
Thaddeus Russell is the originator of this theory, roughly. And I mean, you get this also in Foucault, you get this, funnily enough, in Aristotle as well. In that there are people or men who aren't in the ruling class who might benefit or have a kind of freedom that isn't exactly the same, or actually have a better lot by not having any of responsibility here. Now, Thaddeus Russell wrote this chapter called The Freedom of Slavery in his book Renegade's History of the United States. And this theory sort of always struck with me because how clear it is. And Thaddeus Russell has gotten a lot of pushback for this on this theory, because he points out like that that his whole rough theory in that book is that like slaves, as well as for that matter Jews, Irish, and others, created modern culture, and they were afforded the kind of freedom, so to speak, that the wannabe parts of the ruling class and the ruling class itself and the elites were not afforded, because they were sort of had to be uptight and so forth. Cornel West, even in a sense, I found another interview, in a sense agrees with this, even amongst the American black population. Like, you have the people that wearing the suits and ties who get called Uncle Toms, and then you have the people who wear the basketball shorts and the things like that. So there is a sort of a demarcation between those two groups here. So I mean, so that's sort of in a sort of broad cultural sense here, like that slaves, and that for matter, wage slaves and employees. In our episode on is wage slavery. Now you got some pushback from that, which is fine, but you know, the Kevin Carson argument goes basically something like this, and I think Murray Rothbard would somewhat agree with it too. That roughly certain big businesses in particular, get privileges from the state, and because of that, it's harder to be a petit bourgeois or a sort of small tradesman. So in that sense, if slavery is a lack thereof choices and you can't run away, or can't run away fairly easily in the Walter Blockian sense, a large amount of employees are effectively slaves in some sense. Although, and this is where I would think it gets interesting, is and this is what sort of the heart of the argument, which is that the employees do not get held responsible as much as upper management and ownerships and masters. So this is the link between slavery, okay, in the sort of classical sense, and in the chattel sense, and as well as modern day, what we'll call corporate slavery or wage slavery here. So the boss is held to a higher standard here, and this is true of Christianity here. You had the line, I think it's in the book of James, where the teachers are going to be held to a higher standard. You shouldn't be careful about being a teacher, and I think in general, you hold the boss, you hold the manager, you hold the ruling class to a higher standard than the peasants and the people at the bottom, which goes back into the third Thaddeus Russell thesis here, or the bottom classes are afforded a kind of freedom here, which the upper classes, or the wannabe ones, aren't. Now, the middle class remains to be the hard problem to do. I guess the question there is trajectory, which is upwardly mobile or downwardly mobile, and so forth here. But that sort of sense is the broad layout of the theory here, and that in my own personal experience, not to make too much about that, and I don't really want to go too much into it, but like one of the different Tom Woods brings this up too, that like if you grow up in a household where your dad's a boss or a business owner, what you find is you're like, unlike if your parents are employees, the employee parents will complain about the boss, but the boss parents will complain about their employees. So, and if a business, and this goes back to like the different types of things, like one of the things that socialists, I think, miss, and this is what separates the left from the right, is scarcity here. So there is some amount of work that probably has to be done to have an advanced industrial society, or even any society. So like things don't just grow on trees. So some amount of work is necessary, and that work requires discipline and management to do either self-management, or you have to manage others or get managed. One of the others. Order takers, order followers here. And you can again go back into sort of Carsianite theories about like, who what would an ideal society, is it the state or is it the corporation, which is worse, and so forth here. But broadly, and I think this separates the left from the right, is there some kind of authority, that certain organizations have some kind of authority, other organizations don't have that kind of as much authority. And Thaddeus Russell, to go back to Thaddeus Russell theory, would point out that workers, that socialism properly done requires a lot of meetings. And this is what he brought up to Michael Brooks in one of his interviews here, that your version of socialism basically requires the workers, we'll overthrow the bosses, but they'll become all the bosses. And you get, this is like the back, no one wants to, lots of people don't want to be bosses because they don't want to go to meetings, which goes back to the point that I brought about, my anecdote as well, Tom Woods' anecdote, is that, I'm not a boss worshiper at all here, but there is a kind of responsibility that lower employees don't have in general. So when Bernie Madoff gets investigated, you're not going after his secretary or the plumbers or janitors. You're going after the higher things. And again, when societies get occupied, oftentimes the lower members are basically let off the hook. The upper management and elites, they'll get decapitated or something like that. So that's the broad outlook here. The and my question is here: is the Thaddeus Russell thesis correct, or at least does it have some truth to it? Now there is a lot of wrinkles into it, like in the middle class is a wrinkle here. So Swithin, what do you make of it? Do you think it's plausible that the lower classes and have a kind of which includes obviously slaves, wage slaves, and corporate, certain corporate wage slaves. And what do you make of it? Would you say the yeoman type contractors are freer? I mean, this is the Jefferson line that yeoman farmers are the salt of the earth, but they, in a sense, have both problems. They have to, manage themselves, and they have to, so there's burdens of being self-manager here. So if you make mistakes, you could face ruin here. And that's something that employees, now the company could go out of business, but that's something that lower classes, they don't have that kind of responsibility. So Swithin, what do you make of my outline of this theory?
I think that there's a decent level of truth to it. Although I think first and foremost we need to sort of define a little bit, what kind of freedom we're talking about. I think here the easiest way to think about it, and I think this is in the way in which Thaddeus Russell meant it, was basically working less and having less responsibility, such that you had less cares and you could kind of do more what you wanted to do. And by want, I mean things that you wouldn't need to be paid to do, or things that you don't need to do to stay alive. It gives you more of this time, and then additionally, you maybe don't have the responsibility, so you're not anxious in your time, but you are sort of quote unquote taking off, such as oh no, I really should be going over the tax accounts again because oh no, we've got an audit coming up or something like that. So I think that's broadly speaking, I think how Russell is using the term, and I think given that use of the term, I think to some extent that's correct. Social obligations for one thing. The higher you are on the ladder, the more responsibility you have. I mean, also the number of hours you work is much higher. If you're on a board of a large organization, you're going to be working serious number of hours each week, significantly more than any of your employees will. Well, lower down, that is. And so you have significantly less time to do things that you might otherwise do. That's not true. I mean, Elon Musk is well known for working crazy hours, but I'm sure just like 60, 70, maybe 80 hours a week. I mean, all he's doing is working. Now, I suppose you could claim that Elon Musk actually likes doing what he's doing, and so it's not work. So, I mean, this is always a kind of an issue here is, what is work? What is not work? If you like being a musician, is touring work? And it's like, well, it kind of is, because it's tiring and you got to set up and move and change everywhere. And so to do different performances. It's certainly the case that even like low level employees, basically what you do, you turn up to work, you leave, and you come back again. And once you're not at work, you have no care whatsoever because you're not reliant on anything there at all. Managers, for instance, will stay there for longer and they'll have more obligations. obviously, if you don't do particularly well as an employee, then there's going to be some repercussions for you. But I mean, managements can be held responsible for what their workers do, the people are under them. I mean, you have, and I don't know in which circumstances make this works, but there is still in the concepts of law the idea of vicarious liability, whereby the higher management can be liable for their actions of their underlings. Now, I'm not sure whether this would entirely absolve the underlings of any responsibility at all, but it would certainly lessen it to some extent. So I think that is true. Now, it's interesting to mention Christianity because I actually think, in a way, that Christianity increases the obligations on the lower classes. In the idea that a broadly speaking moral, ethical existence is expected of all peoples, of all classes, of all people groups, and there's no there's no difference in the requirements of them. Now, of course, as you pointed out, the leaders have more obligations, but I think they increase the requirements on the lower classes. I mean, this can be clearly more easily seen in sort of more evangelical Protestantism. You might want to cite late 19th century, and also actually the impetus behind the secular progressives, which is, well, moral improvement. It's like, well, why? I mean, the modern progressive cannot abide there being the existence of any individual racialists anywhere, even if they're kind of doing their own thing or on the way. They can't abide that. They have to have central power to make sure that that bad existence is removed and they are morally improved. This is actually an impetus, which you could argue is similar in certain respects to Christianity, in that, well, everyone's expected to live a moral life. They know, I mean, the classics of argument, say Romans 1, everyone knows, everybody knows God and put his precepts and are in like a sense of intuitive sense of natural law and should behave morally. Whereas in other cultures, like, well, it's slaves, they can do what they want. And kind of the slaves, you don't expect them to have the same thing, same standards of behavior. So I do think it changes in that respect, but it is true that it will hold the leaders to higher standards. As to who is the most free, which is a question, clearly the slave is limited in certain respects because he can't go where he wants. That's obviously true. The boss we talked about, and clearly the employee has the problem that he has to do what his employer says, and even as Nassim Taleb has said, employees are essentially forms of slave, because you sign this employment contract, but it's basically you do whatever your employer says, otherwise he fires you. That's essentially what happens. Now, I know there's employment tribunals and stuff like that, but that's effectively what happens. I mean, you could say it's extreme, but just to make this clear, almost all employees do more than they're contractually obligated to do. This is why the unions can engage in work to rule, and that can cause an issue because if you're, say, contracted to finish at, say, 5 o'clock and you're on a phone call, you could go, "Oh, sorry, sir, I finished work now. I will ring you again tomorrow when I return." That would really mess up a company, but would be something that would be consistent with your employment contract. But that kind of thing typically doesn't happen. And basically, it happens a lot. I mean, you would essentially be let go at some point, probably somehow. So the employer has a problem. I would say in general, it's in a way like the independent contractor. I'd agree with Jefferson to some extent, the yeoman farmer. He who's basically self-employed doesn't really employ anybody else. He attends his own garden, as it were. So in the modern sense, today, I would say, I mean, if you're somebody who can work remotely, at least insofar as you don't get all your bank accounts cancelled, maybe you do a Kanye, and certain groups might decide to close off all your financial assets, or maybe Justin Trudeau will do the same thing if you're in Canada. But barring stuff like that, if you can remotely, you can effectively work anywhere. So you can live and work wherever you wish. And if you take contracts, what's good about like a short-term contract, it's not an employment contract, is it's clear your obligations are clear. You know what you're doing, and when you've done it, you don't do anything else. I had a friend of mine who was at my church who did that. He liked very much being a freelance quantity surveyor because he knew he wouldn't be obligated with all this additional stuff that would be required of him as a as an employee. Now, clearly, those people have the stress, as it were, of maybe finding a job or their contracts dry up. But given the fact that they are sufficiently in demand, then they have a lot more freedom. They can decide how long they want to work. They might decide, we'll take this contract, I'll take a bit of time off. That's fine. It's not an issue. Obviously, you have the issue that their skill level could go down over time and whatever, and they're out of the scene and things change. But those are the workers who would seem to have the most freedom. They're not having to run a business, constantly concerned about how that's working or whatever. They're not having concerned about being fired from their job, because remember, if you're in a job, it's basically having one contract. You only ever have like anytime one person you're working for, and that's like your whole income. Whereas if you're a contractor in a given period of time, you can be working with multiple people. So it doesn't matter if someone leaves, someone else joins. So fine, it's not an issue. So I would say, and also I suppose you could say the freest individual, you could argue, is the individual who has no family ties or fewer family ties in certain respects, because then he can kind of do what he wants in the time and he doesn't have any family commitments with children or whatever. Now, that doesn't mean that children, etc., are bad, or that there isn't a freedom that comes from that in certain sense. But if we're going on sort of like obligation, then that's again something that one could consider. So yes, in general, I do think that that Russell's position does make sense in certain respects, and it shouldn't be dismissed outright.
Question two here, and I'm gonna, like, as usual, sketch my own outline somewhat. Is everyone capable of being either their own self owner? We've done an episode, is Aristotle right about slavery? Um, and accept this broadly, or being the manager of others, and heck, being the manager of a lot of people, like let's say a CEO. To bring up CEOs, I know I have plenty of criticisms of Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, but and we sort of asked the sketch outline of this question at our Keith Preston episode on "Can a Society Without Elites Exist?" or something like that. And it's quite clear to me that you can say that's all socialization, but it's quite clear that, and you can cut out lines for certain handicapped people, but it's quite clear that there's a big difference between a person who between Elon Musk or Bill Gates, for better or for worse, and many people. So it doesn't seem like everyone's capable of it, or for that matter, wants it. That's another thing about ambition and will and so forth. In this sense, in some ways, I lack. Maybe I'm a nihilist in some technical sense, but in some sense, I lack as much will as some people to do certain things, just because I view them as maybe not pointless, but not worth the huge cost of going through and doing them. And I think that's true for a lot of other people too. That there is a certain path of least resistance. Become in this sense, yes, Bezos workers are worked hard, get carpal tunnel, but but Bezos does work things probably all the time. He probably works more than his employees do. He probably does. Now it's a different type of work. It's not as damaging type of work, and it's not labor, but it's management. And this goes back to the Thaddeus Russell problem with Michael Brooks in that socialism or anarcho-syndicalism or classical Marxism involves a lot of doing the worker sort of sounds has to take over the boss. Maybe there's a panic here that will be reached where he can fish in the morning and read philosophy in the afternoon. Maybe that panic here maybe can eventually be reached via technology, but that's not there yet. Maybe it is there. I don't know. I'm skeptical of that. That goes back to the difference between the left and the right. I think scarcity and how much scarcity exists is one of the central things. But back to the question, can everybody be either a self owner or a manager of others? You know, and does everyone want to do that? So then, take it away. What would you answer to this question? I suspect I would say no on both accounts. What would you make of this?
Well, clearly not. I mean, people don't. I mean, I don't want to be a boss of people. I think it'd be incredibly annoying having to manage somebody else and being responsible in certain respects for them. I mean, that would just be additional hassle that I don't really want. I mean, and it's clear as well that I think that people are not the skill set required for managing and running an organization. Most people simply don't have. and they don't have the motivation to do so either. Um, I mean, even for getting high up in, even in a situation where you don't really manage people, I mean, the differential in ambition is large, in particular between men and women. I know a pediatrician who basically said that most of the people he trained were women, but most of them didn't really want to become a consultant. They just wanted to get to a reasonable grade where effectively they could work part time because they'll have kids eventually, and they can earn decent money, but they won't earn like a consultant salary. But pretty much all the guys who were on there were like, well, yeah, I want to become a consultant because what's the point of doing it otherwise? So there's a massive sort of sex difference there. Um, but just in general ability, I think managing other people and having that ambition to try and organize and stuff just isn't really there. I think an interesting question though is to what extent are people able to run their own affairs? As in, could everybody be like an independent electrician? Could everybody be an independent bricklayer or something? And I think to the extent that they're reasonably skilled, maybe I think that is a possibility. Although the problem would be you've got additional sort of marketing problems. So I mean, the stuff I do, my marketing is kind of done for me by the agencies I effectively work for. So that would be kind of a way around it. But then, of course, you need the agencies to exist. Though I suppose you could be an independent agent, and that's the only thing you do, which is possible. You could do that. But one of the problems, especially these days, is if you're going to be a one man band, you've got to be noticed. And I say you can try and contract that out, but otherwise you might not get much business. Now, of course, you could always build that up by word of mouth, but that would probably require you doing some work on the side. And also, a lot of people are concerned. A lot of people, even if they could do it, they actually like the security of being employed. One of the issues I have is I can't find anybody who will insure me if I'm ill. So normally, if you're in work, if you become ill, you will get paid. You get sick pay, and you might get less if you're sick for a long time, whatever. But you'll get sick pay. Now the problem with me is I can only get critical illness cover, which is basically, yeah, you're going to die soon, but we'll pay out early. It's like, well, that's kind of not what I want. I kind of want, well, what if I'm ill for 2 weeks? Can I have some money coming in somehow? I can't find anybody who will insure me. So even if people are capable, you've got to then take into account to what extent people value security and risk. Now, that's going to be contingent on various times and places. But I do think today a lot of people, well, I think it's pretty obvious from the the sheeple responses to coronavirus is, oh, govern me harder, daddy, govern me harder, make me secure from this evil external threat. But a lot of people do that now. If you didn't have state education or whatever and welfare, would that be different? I think that would be different to some extent. But the number of people I think who would really want to run a firm, I mean, a lot of people might try, might just give up. Because from the sounds of it, the people I know who like, basically run their own proper businesses, I mean, eh, it's hard work. I mean, a lot of people would rather earn a bit less and have more free time. I mean, this is the big blind spot. I mean, bring up Jeff Bezos and stuff. Is a big blind spot of the left in general. I mean, like, even though they're not toiling in the fields, the bosses do work, and the bosses work a lot in most cases. As I mentioned before, the higher you go, the more hours you work in general. Now, you can be in certain fields where you can earn a lot and not work much, but then you've got to be a consultant of some description. Not medical necessarily, but you could be a contractor and stuff. But if you're in a firm, whatever, you're going to be there before your employees turn up, and you'll leave after them. You'll get paid more, you'll have high prestige, but you'll have less time. And not everybody's going to want that. So, yeah, I don't think that many people have the disposition to be uh, run other people, run a business. I think people don't think would prefer to have security of somebody else employing them. But I do think a lot of people might have the possibility of um, being independent, or at least being a partnership with somebody else, and so they're not really employee employer, but they're kind of horizontal federation of individuals who are sort of working together. They may be independent, they won't be responsible for a joint name, but they'll kind of work together and help in some respects. But even then, I think people would trade that for security. So that would be my overall response.
The very fact that people take those the very fact that people take those type of deals, freedom for security, suggests that the sort of Carsianite, and for that matter, Preston, Chomsky, you know, line that that the corporations are in slavery is not entirely true, insofar as um, if it is slavery, it's voluntary slavery, which then begs the question here of what exactly is freedom, what exactly is slavery. I mean, this Nassim Taleb goes into this one of his books here. That if you're giving out a tail, now you can argue that you're not really giving up that sort of. You talked about your own risk of like you can't take any sick days, but like if you're an employee, that's one of the in theory benefits you get. Now whether you actually get that, whether modern work is more precarious than like to say the 1950s, that's or whatever, that those are good questions here. But the very fact that people take this makes me suspectful that it's more voluntary slave. Now, interesting, I think historical things like serfdom and other things at the time, many people basically, this John Gray, philosopher, wrote a book, Modernization Commission. I mean, certain modern people look back at like serfs with a kind of sneer. Arguably, serfs were quite quote unquote happy, whether they were or not. It begs the question over what is freedom again. So the very fact that people, take all these deals and like are given the other options, ask the question. Now, of course, you could always say, there's certain factors that, and this goes back to like, it's hard to be a petite bourgeois business yeoman because the state makes it such, and that very well might be in the case. It is the case, arguably, but you also have to ask why do those things exist here? Maybe it's the progressive state that created all these barriers to do things like the FDA, various handicapped acts, and so forth. We've touched themes on other episodes. I guess the real view of freedom is like the trust fund baby or the UBI person. But see, this is where Kant can be used against the left. Kant has his categorical imperative. You have to sort of imagine everyone acting that way. Well, in this sense, not everyone can be, the son of a rich person, or a UBI person here. Again, maybe technology one day will get us there, or maybe it's already there and it's just prevented and so forth. That's a sort of David Graeber argument here. But not everyone can do that because and this sort of showed up in COVID here. Like the necessary workers had to continue going out and doing things. The UPS drivers, the fish, the people who sort the fish, the people who pick up the garbage. All these tasks are still yet to be automated, or haven't been automated, or can't be automated. They still have to be done. Someone has to do them, and those people have to go out and do them. So not everyone can be not everyone could be a trust fund baby, or for that matter, UBI. And things like UBI, again, and this is where Foucault kicks in. This is Thaddeus Russell, one of his thinker mentors. And again, there's a right wing Foucault and there's a left wing Foucault. I like the right wing Foucault. One of the things he points out about welfare is welfare, in a sense, is an olive branch, but in also sense, it's a way to control people. Like state housing, it's a sense of way to control people. It infantilizes them. It sort of demutes their expectations and so forth. If you get into state housing or state welfare, you basically become like a video game incel Wally character in a sense. Now, again, I don't know. You're probably not really a parasite with a capital P based on your living standards, but still, in a sense, welfare and UBI come with problems that aren't fully fleshed out, partly because, well, we haven't done it on a large scale, but to the extent that we've done it in minor scales, it is true that the welfare destroyed the power for the family in the lower classes, and particularly the blacks, as well as the whites, too. So there are baggage that comes with UBI. There are baggage that comes with, for that matter, trust funds for kids as well that don't fully get fleshed out. Now, there is a kind of freedom that gives, but what kind of freedom is that? So maybe that's a fifth category that we're missing. But that fifth category, I don't think exists in large scale. And whether it can exist in the future is a good question. What do you make of that line of analysis within? I could ask like a question like, what is the most desirable thing? Which is my third question here, the document I preparing for this. But like, it seems like you want to have all the benefits, no responsibilities would be the ideal thing. But like, what would that even entail here? Swethan, what do you make of that?
Well, I think you're right. The situation where you have no responsibilities or whatever is essentially a situation where you're you inherit vast swathes of money, or you have a UBI situation where you have zero obligations of any description really to anybody or anybody. You don't need to work, and you can do what you want. But as you point out, I mean, this is somewhat of an infantilizing situation. So, um, is it really that having no obligations is freeing, or is work freeing? Shall work set you free? Does that actually is that actually a good? Is that freedom in a sense? And then this is kind of, I think, really, I mentioned before, freedom is such a plastic term. I'm very loath to use it now because it's so ambiguous. And I think a lot of the time when people use the term freedom, what they mean is like a flourishing, a good life. And would it be a good life if you did nothing and you had no obligations? Well, probably not. I used to do this thought experiment when I was working elsewhere with some kids, and it was what I tended to find is that people just ended up doing like A levels, which was basically high school, like 16 to 18. Um, in the UK, and they did them because well everybody else did them, and that was the kind of thing. And there was no real direction in what they were doing. And so what I would say is, well, where do you want to be? What do you want to do by the time you're like 40? What would you kind of want your life to look like? And then I gave him another question. It's like, well, if you're like a multi-billionaire, what would you use your time for? I mean, would you just sit back and play computer games all the time, or would you just go and play sports, or would you do something else? And a lot of the time, they were trying to find things they thought were somewhat meaningful to do, and that would give them a sense of purpose. And so, actually, just sort of playing on games and stuff doesn't really do that. Although I suppose you could argue that people who are like streamers or whatever do actually get that because, in the sense, they're kind of creating. And I think this is the conclusion I came to discussing that kind of thing with them: is that humans to be feel like they are doing something of meaning and having value, they need to create something. I mean, an employee creates value for his employer, and he seems to make some. He seems to have some worth, and so I think um, what people want to do to somebody is to do things which they find are meaningful. And those people who just play games and become the incel type, I mean, they don't particularly like their life. They might like it originally, but then they're kind of like stuck. Um, so in that sense, obviously, the slave is unfree in a sense, is because of the slave cannot become, as it were, the master of himself. Can't decide what to do. Doesn't have the an interesting thing. The slave cannot develop wisdom in the same sense. He cannot be the wise decision maker of his own life, of what to do and how to devote his time, etc., and do endeavors that he thinks are valuable. He has to do what his master tells him to do. Now, of course, in principle, the master could give him a lot of freedom to decide what he does for himself, which of course is possible. Um, but I think that, as it were, is one of the probably the strongest arguments as to why slavery is unfree, because in many cases, people's objections to slavery are kind of lame, because you go, well, okay, what if your slave master treated you really well, gave you a decent job, gave you good living conditions or whatever, but he won't let you leave. How bad would that be? And then, because then people are kind of like, well, because what they always focus on is like, as it were, low status slavery. Oh, as an aside with that, actually, which is interesting, Game of Thrones at one point, um, there was some of the former slaves wanted to be changed the law so they could be re-enslaved because they had good social status and worked as tutors and stuff for aristocratic houses, and wanted slavery to be reinstated. Now, whether or not they could do that on a contractual basis is another question, but at least it was interesting that the slaves might want sort of slavery back, as it were, because it was actually better for them in certain respects. But the fact that they couldn't leave, it means that, as I say, they lack that kind of mastery. which is interesting. That might be an argument against sort of perpetual contracts of certain types, which then actually goes in most of voluntary slavery. That, of course, Walter Block always rears his head as to whether you can sign the indefinite voluntary slave contract and have the master enforce it by force. I think I've answered your question, although I've touched on some other things.
Yes, we'll probably wrap it up shortly here, but I want to hit on one final point, and I think the question of over freedom. You say you don't like using that word here, and I think that's fine. In on one level, it's fine. On another level, it's not fine because we can't I don't want to continuously keep conceding words, maybe not to the enemy, or at least to the abyss at minimum. Like, just all these words are meaningless, so you have to keep terming new toys. In a sense, libertarian was Rothbard's word that he stole, but in the sense, judging from Reason Magazine or Joe Jordanson, what really is the difference between Joe Jordanson and Nancy Pelosi? I mean, if you give me a magnifying glass at some, or even for that matter, Hayek, give me a magnifying glass, and you start, you have to look for differences here. Now, maybe the rhetoric's difference, but you can't keep conceding words. I think that word's useful. I think that word's useful for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, because it is the flourishing, good life. I think that's or at least the ability or opportunity to do so here. I do think we still are a sort of libertarian podcast of some kind here, or right libertarian in particular here. So this is like the sort of limits, like what exactly things are the case here. And I think it's a blind spot for the libertarian left, like a Carson, like a Chomsky, as well as from the sort of welfare state left in general, because their objections to slavery could also be rendered at the welfare state, which for the most part they advocate or certainly don't oppose. So like as you stated, the objections to slavery are lame. They are lame. I mean, that you can't run away. Like the Walter Blockian thing is probably that you can't run away, and whether you can do the voluntary, like what are the aspects of it here, and that to me you have to sort of outline that in a more clear way here, because the Marxists also want a kind of freedom too, but what exactly is it? Is it is it the freedom of slavery here? So yeah, I've always been struck by Thaddeus Russell's argument, because on one hand it's a very highfalutin philosophical argument, but on the other hand it's also a very practical argument here, because if you tried to run a business and if you worked for a major corporation, I've seen to some extent firsthand, the virtues and vices of both of them. Now, there is always this sort of structural argument that hangs over here. Like, if things were made better, it could be easier to open a business, or if central banks went away, or if um um various other things went away, or if there were better reparations. And this is goes to who exploits whom, the Leninist question type of thing. Um, Things could be made better here, but like in this sense, I think freedom shouldn't be entirely conceded, and it has a practical benefit too, because most people aren't trust fund babies in the full sense, and they probably wouldn't listen to this podcast either. So that would be my overall comment, like why I want to do it. I think Thaddeus Russell, in this sense, is an original thinker because you get it in parts, but I don't think those two chapters. I don't think you get um perfectly juxtaposed, so to speak, here. That'd be my overall comments on Swithing. If you want to comment or just wrap it up, that'd be great. Thanks for doing it.
I'm not saying that freedom cannot be used coherently. It's just that it's rarely done. And I just think in general, it's easier to talk about specifics as to what you think should be the case um, rather than try to pin your position to a word. That's all I'm saying. So, I mean, maybe I'm not the greatest marketer. I suppose the best thing to do would be to sort of coin your own term, I suppose, and then it's more difficult to be misrepresented. But I just get fed up with people hiding behind words. I'm not saying you're hiding behind words. It's just that it's it's something that's easily done, and especially with freedom, I think that's very much the case. And as I say, it's not an obvious concept. But I do really think when people use the term freedom, what they mean is basically a flourishing life, ultimately, in which there might be requirements for negative and positive freedoms in certain sense. So
Would you say that would you say that the objections to slavery also apply to the welfare state? Would you say that also applies?
Oh, to a large extent, yes. In that you don't really have that kind of control that the slave does. Although it is true that in the consumer sense, that the UBI. No,
You're not forced to work. You're not forced to work.
yes,
That's a
yes,
big difference.
but go on.
But the other aspects of your life, I mean, in a sense, you're in some ways free, but in other ways, it's a form of unfreedom. Insofar as like you can't really get out of that situation. It's sort of a trap in that sense. And like that's another message that Thaddeus Russell, for all Thaddeus Russell's, and this is one thing pointed out commonly, that Thaddeus Russell is a private businessman at this point. He runs Renegade University. I mean, he's a petit bourgeois person par excellence in a sense. But he complains about the fact that he has to like constantly market his shows and everything here. And like again, his critiques of Michael Brooks's like version of socialism, which might be a more participatory version, or sort of like a grassroots. But then that begs the question too, over like, can everybody do that? Does everybody want to do that? And and you have to sort of ask the question of like, why did the socialist revolution fail? And like, I mean, we have this sort of welfare state capitalism here. So that would be my point here. I think it's an interesting theory here. I think that's a practical output. But that sorry for interrupting you.
But yeah, I think the main critique I'd say of UBI is the sense it's infantilizing. You are essentially a child. That's effectively what you can end up being under UBI. And that's the way I critique it. And then that's sort of, I think, one of the better critiques of slavery, I would say. So, and then ultimately as well, I mean, if you did have like universal UBI, you would have to work. Like, you clearly would. I mean, there's no way that you're going to get enough people to work to generate enough resources so people don't work and can generate lots of income. So on a small scale, to some extent, yeah, maybe. But on a large scale, permanently, I think that highly unlikely. Because it simply wouldn't be affordable. And then you'd have to have the situation of which Lenin said, the man who shall not work shall not eat, which is ultimately what would happen, I think. And now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.